So our talk today is really in large part about what qualifies as evidence to begin with, and then do we have any of that stuff that we could actually use to examine the claims of the Gospels? Does that make sense? Circumstantial cases. And you might be thinking to yourself, circumstantial? Nobody sees that word as a positive. Everyone who talks about circumstantial evidence sees it as a negative. And that's the first thing I want to dispel you of today. Now, it turns out that this stuff we're talking about, this is how you work cold cases. This is the nature of cold cases. But if you really think about it, it's kind of the nature of the Christian worldview, too. You're investigating an event in the distant past for which we have no living eyewitnesses we can re-interview personally, and we have no forensic physical evidence we can test. We have to build the case cumulatively on circumstantial evidence. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. Dateline, whatever the reason is, witnesses sometimes lie. Now, I'll tell you something. People will ask, and Bart Ehrman's just done a debate recently, written a book about eyewitness testimony, and how unreliable it is. That's nonsense. But the point I'm trying to make here is this. I don't trust eyewitnesses. I never have. Even when they tell me something that would help me, I don't trust eyewitnesses. You'd be a fool to trust an eyewitness. You test an eyewitness. Now, if they pass the test, you are instructed by the judge to trust them. But they got to pass the test first. So as a guy who did not believe what you guys believe as Christians, I wanted to know if I applied this test to the authors of the Gospels, would they pass? That's how I became a Christian. So I want to share a piece of that with you. Very short piece, okay? But we're going to start. First question I had to ask is, were the people who wrote the Gospels really there to see what it is they said they saw? That's so critical to me. Right? If you're not there, you can't be a witness. So this is what it comes down to. The first one, present. This guy here actually confessed to a crime that occurred on Thanksgiving Day. In our country, that's in November. This guy confessed to taking a 10-year-old girl, kidnapping her on Thanksgiving Day. Horrific what he confessed to. 1,000-page transcript of every horrific thing he did to her and then how he killed her and got rid of the body. None of it is true. He's got some issues, but he's not a killer. We eliminated him on the eve of the trial with blood evidence. But you cannot be the killer if you weren't present. He wasn't present. You also can't be a witness, though, if you weren't present, and that's what I suspected about the Bible. I suspected that the Gospels were written so late that they cannot be considered reliable eyewitness testimony. But that means that Mark's account has to be earlier. Now, I want you to see how close we are to the actual events. Now, I can tell you I'm off on that. I mean, I think this is a case you could make. And I just told you why I made it, okay? But if I'm wrong by 10 years, it's still too early. If I'm wrong by 20 years, it's still too early. If I'm wrong by 30 years, it's still too early, folks. Not every memory is treated equal. If you ask me, what did I do on the 14th of last month, I probably couldn't even tell you. It's only been a week. But if you ask me, what did you do on like February 14th? Well, that's a little bit different. That's Valentine's Day. I could probably get close. Jim, what did you do on February 14th, 1988? I can give you 7 or 8 hours in detail on that day. That's the day I got married. Details, because these events stick out. I don't expect people to remember on some odd weekday 2 years ago. But if you saw someone walking on water, you might remember that. That might stick out in your mind. Not every memory is equal. This is true in criminal cases too. In the end, I felt like that was a good reason to believe these are early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses. Have these been altered? Are they accurate and honest over time? This guy killed his wife in 1981, and he claimed that she ran off, and he reported her missing. And we did not work the case as a murder for the first 6 years. We took a missing persons report. We didn't even photograph the house. 6 years later, he's moved, he's in a different house, and guess what? Not a single piece of physical evidence, not even a photograph of the crime scene. Nothing. Lots of open questions. How did he kill her? I don't know. Where did he kill her? I don't know. How did he get rid of her body? No body missing. I don't know. How did he move her car to make it look like she ran off? I don't know. They convicted him in 4 hours of jury deliberation. And at sentencing, he confessed to all of it and gave us the location of the body. So we were right, although we had no evidence that was physical in nature, And not even, now how do we do that? Because he changed his story over time. He had one story in 1981, and by the time we contacted him in 1986, he had a slightly different story with more detail. That's not usually the way it happens. It usually goes the other way around. In 1996, he had more detail. In 2010, he had even more detail. By the time we arrested him in 2013, he had all kinds of detail. That's a problem. His changing story over time gave him away. And I suspected that was the case with the Gospels. Something has changed over time. This might be an early account. I don't care if it's early. Even if it is early, it could still be wrong because it could have been changed over time. I mean, early is important as far as the first step, but it's not everything. How do I know that what was written back in the first century is what we have in our Bibles today? Gospel of John, it's written in the first century. Then later on, you're going to tell me that this is the same gospel over here. How do you know how many times in the middle? 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times? It's been changed. And the people who follow have no idea that it's been changed. They're just like me, unsuspecting, but duped. Do you see the problem here? This is not an uncommon complaint. This is where I stood for a lot of years as an atheist. Now, I know how to deal with this now. I didn't know how to deal with it then. This is called the chain of custody. Every significant piece of evidence in a criminal trial, you have to demonstrate the chain of custody. Here's my question. Do we have a chain of custody for the New Testament? Yes, I'll show you one. Here's our crime scene. Here's our courtroom over here. First officer at the scene is a guy named John. The question, of course, is what's in his Polaroid? What's in his supplemental report? Well, he gave it to somebody. Who is the next officer in the chain of custody that he gave it to? John had 3 students, Papias, Ignatius, and Polycarp. If you were wondering what John wrote, you could simply ask his students, because after he died, these students were raised up to a position of leadership in the church. So these guys wrote their own letters to local churches describing what it is they learned from John. As a matter of fact, Ignatius, there are now 7 letters that remain, and you can see that he's alluding to the works of John, the works of a couple other of the gospel authors, and several letters from Paul. We don't have any work from Papias, but we do have one letter from Polycarp where he's alluding to several books of the New Testament as well. So if you're wondering what John wrote, just ask these guys. But if you're wondering what these guys wrote, ask their student. The next officer in the chain of custody, who is the student of Ignatius and Polycarp, his name is Irenaeus. He wrote a ton of stuff. We still have much of it, a great defender of the Gospels. And he actually has a list. He wrote a list of 24 New Testament books that he was using with his students. Don't let anyone tell you that the canon of Scripture is created at some church council. It's not. It's simply confirmed at a church council. They've been quoting it immediately. They've been listing it hundreds of years before these councils. Got it? The next chain in custody is a guy named Hippolytus, the student of Irenaeus. But Hippolytus gets into some trouble, and I cannot find a student of Hippolytus. He dies in custody. So the chain of custody ends here. But by the way, in chains of custody, the early part is more important than the later part. We kind of know what the later part says. Here's another chain of custody from Paul through his student Clement, who you have in his letters, who becomes a bishop in Rome, who writes a beautiful letter that was used by the early church called First Clement. You can read it to see what he learned from Paul. Through the Roman bishopry to Justin Martyr, who is the teacher of Tatian. I cannot find a student of Tatian. Here's Peter, who taught Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark, and then hand-selected the first 5 bishops in the North African church, who founded a school in Alexandria. Pontineus is the first headmaster. His student is Clement. It's a different Clement than that Clement, although like all these guys, they kind of look the same. White guys with beards, okay, that's all right. There are a couple of rock stars here, though. Look, you got Origen, he's a rock star. Look over here, Justin Martyr, he's a rock star too. Anyway, the point is, Pontineus has got Clement, whose student is Origen, whose student is Pamphilus, whose student is Eusebius, and we've got a longer chain of custody. Got it? What's great about these chains of custody is they're in 3 completely different regions of the world, and you can't Snapchat each other. You can't Instagram each other to say, hey, what are you guys using down there for your Bible? What's it say? What do you say about this? So we can see a chain of custody with image after image after image, report after report after report in 3 regions: Rome, Asia Minor, North Africa. What do we know? Well, if you lost every piece of Scripture, there wasn't a single Bible on the planet, but all you had were the first officers in the chain of custody, here's what you would know about Jesus. Is he simpler? Is he just a simple preaching rabbi who doesn't do any miracles? He's not very supernatural, and that's the legend of Jesus that grows over time? No. The very first account of Jesus, he's born of a virgin. He works miracles. He dies on a cross. He rises from the dead. He ascends into heaven. He's seen at the right hand of the Father. You are stuck with supernatural Jesus in all of his robust glory from the very first account all the way through. That stuff's never changed. There's no different version of Jesus over the history. So this idea that he's changed over time just isn't true. Finally, are they biased? This is what it comes down to when it comes down to bias. It really comes down to motive. What is causing someone to lie to me? Do you realize there's only 3 motives for any murder? Only 3. You don't walk into a death scene and go, oh my gosh, there's 1,000 reasons why someone would kill her. No, there aren't 1,000 reasons. There are 3 reasons. You just find me somebody who's in one of those 3 reasons and we're done, okay? These are the only 3 reasons why anyone commits a murder, the only 3 reasons why anyone lies. Now, if you think, well, how about crazy? No, I mean, if you're crazy, then I can't try you. If you can be found criminally insane, there's no trial. If you aren't found criminally insane, here you go. Got it? So we can apply this then. We could ask ourselves the question. If you think that the disciples are lying to us, no problem, because they have a bias or a motive, there they are. Those are the only reasons why anyone lies. So you tell me, where is it that the disciples have motive? Why are you laughing? Well, they're not getting rich, that's for sure. They're not getting girlfriends. But couldn't you argue that they're getting the respect of their religious communities? That's often been said. Paul is a liar, and he got the respect of his religious community. Oh, really? Think about that for a second. So Paul, as a devout Jew in a position of religious respect and authority, has been commissioned to hunt down the Christians. So he says to himself one day, you know what? I think I'm going to jump out of my position of respect and authority as a Jew and jump in with these Christians and get my butt kicked all over the world for 25 years so that someday I hope to have a position of religious respect. Really? It's possible, but possible doesn't count, only reasonable. And that's not reasonable, because I always say that if you were somebody who was in a position of leadership in the Christian community, you had to suffer this kind of death. These are the traditions of these. And I'm not here to tell you that I trust all these traditions, but I do know this. A lot has been written about Christians, early Christians, and if you wanted to end this controversy, just get one of them to recant and write about it. There is no ancient document in which any of the 12 disciples ever recanted. Do you realize that in the Book of Mormon, if you open it up, there's a cover plate, and it has the 3 witnesses to the golden plates of Mormonism. The 3 witnesses are Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer. Those 3 guys were either chased out of the church or voluntarily left the church. Martin Harris was a member of 6 other Christian denominations after Mormonism. If you say you saw something this transformational, but you're willing to walk away from it, good chance it's not true. These guys never walked away from their claims. Let's go one more step, though, before we end this. I get this all the time, and it drives me nuts. You can't trust the Gospels because they were written by Christians. If you want me to trust some history of Jesus, it has to be a non-Christian document. I can't trust the Christian documents. I can only trust a non-Christian source. Really? That's just stupid. Different than, say, someone like Matthew, who is not part of the discipleship of John the Baptist. He's not expecting or looking for the Messiah. He's a tax collector called Levi who's collecting taxes. Jesus walks up and says, hey, dude, come with me for 3 years. And after watching that for 3 years, he's in. He writes a history called the Gospel of Matthew. And you want to throw that under the bus? Why? Because he has a prior bias? He didn't have a prior bias. He's not part of the clique. He's just convinced on the basis of observation. Now the question is, can we trust what's been written about the gospel in the Gospels about Jesus? And I think we can, because we build this case the same way we build any case. We're talking about eyewitness reliability. It's about 4 legs that determine whether someone's reliable. First, is it early enough to have been written by an eyewitness? I've given you, I think, several good reasons to believe that this is a reasonable inference. Second is, can it be corroborated? We didn't talk about anything in this section. This is an hour talk on its own. I think there's lots of pieces of evidence that we could use to support and verify the claims of the Gospels. I'll send this to you in a video, okay? This is a reasonable inference. The next question, of course, is, has it changed over time? We can actually determine that because we can read it over time to see if it's changed. And I think we've got good reason to say, no, it hasn't changed over time. Finally is, do they possess a bias that should cause you to toss it under the bus? And I don't think they do, because what's in it for them? What do they have to suffer in order to hold this claim? By the way, if you or I were willing to die for what we believe is true about Jesus, that would have zero evidential value. Lots of people die for what they do not know is a lie. But if the original people who saw it, who would know if it's a lie, are willing to die for it, that's different. That's huge. Those are not like people who fly planes into buildings. Those guys would know if it's a lie. All of us don't know. We make a case for it, but those were the original eyewitnesses. If they will die for it, it's got huge evidential value. Do you see the difference? So in the end, I think we got good evidence for this, and I think this is a reasonable inference. So what are we doing here? You see why I call this death by 1,000 paper cuts, and why I do not try to make claims about Christianity on Twitter. Try to do this in 140 characters. Hey, Jim, why do you think the Bible's reliable? Well, you got 2 hours? Let's sit down and talk about it. Otherwise, I'm not going to try to knock this out 140 characters at a time. Make sense? That's pretty brutal. This is the way every cold case is. Trust me, the murder occurs in seconds. I spend the next 30 years putting it back together. This is the nature of how this work is done. If you think you're going to get a quick, easy answer in a criminal trial, you're out of your mind. This answer is not going to be quick and easy, but it will be true. That's the difference. Make sense? In the end, we're trying to build on those 4 pillars. If those 4 pillars are solid, you should trust. As a matter of fact, there's a jury instruction. If those 4 things are solid, you must trust the eyewitness. This thing passed the test for me, and I was stuck. I'm like, what do I do with this? Every way I could test it, it passes the test that I would tell a jury you must trust. So I started thinking harder about this. So I'm not a Christian because it works for me. And I'm not a Christian because I was raised in a Christian family, because I wasn't. I'm not a Christian because I was hoping for heaven or afraid of hell, because that doesn't animate me. That's not my thing. I'm a Christian because it's true. I built the case and I can't run from it. But I would much rather be in an inconvenient truth than in a convenient lie.